Nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills, Lucille Ball's former home was as vibrant as the star herself during her lifetime. A sprawling estate with manicured lawns and a classic mid-century design, it had witnessed countless Hollywood gatherings, heartfelt laughter, and the unmistakable energy of its iconic owner. But in the years following her passing in 1989, the house began to garner attention for more than its history. It became a hotbed of unexplained phenomena. New homeowners moved in, excited to own a piece of Hollywood lore. Yet almost immediately, they began to notice peculiar occurrences. At first, it was subtle. A faint giggle echoing down the hall when no one else was home, or the creak of furniture moving on its own in the middle of the night. Guests dismissed it as the quirks of an old house, but the occurrences became harder to explain. Visitors often reported seeing a shadowy figure on the second floor, fleeting but distinct, a woman with lush, unmistakable hair. The silhouette would sometimes linger near the bedroom windows before disappearing into thin air. One guest, a skeptic by nature, recalled hearing what sounded like a set of high heels clicking across the wooden floors upstairs, only to find the area completely empty. Those who knew Lucille Ball personally began to speculate. Her boundless energy and penchant for humor had defined her in life. Could it be that some part of her still lingered in the place she called home? Neighbors reported hearing bursts of laughter from the property, even when it was vacant. On one occasion, a delivery driver claimed he saw a figure in a vintage dress waving at him from a window. When he rang the doorbell, the homeowner confirmed no one else was inside. Paranormal investigators were eventually called to the house. They set up recording devices, hoping to capture evidence of the unusual activity. In one chilling session, an investigator asked, "Who's here with us?" A faint, static-filled response came through, "Lucy." Despite the eerie tales, the house retained its charm. Some speculated that if Lucille Ball's spirit truly haunted the home, it wasn't out of malice but rather a deep love for the place she had poured her heart into. She loved to entertain, and maybe she's just not ready for the party to end, one neighbor remarked. To this day, the house remains a curious blend of glamour and mystery. Those lucky enough to visit or brave enough to stay can't help but wonder if they'll catch a glimpse of the shadow on the second floor or hear the echo of laughter that once captivated the world. As time went on, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The new owners, determined to live peacefully in their dream home, began documenting the strange events. Cameras installed in the main living areas captured unexplained flickers of movement, shadows darting across walls, faint shapes appearing and disappearing on the staircase. Once, during a dinner party, a heavy chandelier swayed gently above the dining table, even though there was no breeze. Despite the unnerving occurrences, the owners tried to dismiss them. But one evening, everything changed. It was just past midnight when the woman of the house, Claire, was jolted awake by the sound of muffled laughter. It wasn't the warm, spontaneous laughter of a guest. It was playful, mischievous, almost childlike. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder and seemed to move through the walls. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, shaking her husband awake. He groggily dismissed her concerns until the distinct sound of furniture scraping against the hardwood floors came from the living room below. Both froze. Gathering their courage, they crept downstairs together, clutching a flashlight. The grand living room lay bathed in moonlight, the furniture exactly as they'd left it except for a single armchair. It had been dragged into the center of the room, facing the large bay window. On the coffee table, a dusty rotary phone, an antique they'd inherited with the house, sat off the hook, its dial still spinning slowly. Claire picked up the receiver, her hand trembling. At first, there was nothing but static. But then, faintly, came a sound that sent chills down her spine. A woman humming the tune of "I Love Lucy's" theme song. The couple didn't sleep that night. By morning, Claire was convinced that Lucille Ball's presence wasn't just a whimsical story, it was real. She delved into the house's history, poring over old records, photographs, and even reaching out to neighbors who had lived in the area for decades. What she uncovered was both fascinating and unnerving. A former housekeeper who had worked for Ball in the 1960s shared a particularly chilling memory. Ms. Ball had this superstition about the upstairs bedroom, the elderly woman revealed. She used to say she'd never truly leave the house, not as long as her dressing table was there. She joked about it, of course, but there was something in her eyes, a seriousness that didn't quite match her usual humor. Claire was determined to find the dressing table. Claire wasted no time. She searched the house from top to bottom, feeling a strange pull toward the second floor, the site of many of the odd occurrences. The staircase creaked underfoot as she ascended, the air thick with the weight of years and untold stories. She knew this house like the back of her hand, yet tonight, it felt foreign, almost alive, as if it were watching her every step. She reached the master bedroom, and there it was. The dressing table, tucked away in the corner beneath a large, ornate mirror. The brass trim gleamed in the dim light, but it was the reflection in the glass that caught her attention. Something wasn't right. At first, she thought it was her own image, but when she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. The reflection wasn't just of her. There was a figure, faint but unmistakable, standing behind her. A woman with dark, flowing hair. Claire spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath hitched as she returned her gaze to the mirror. The figure was still there, standing just behind her in the reflection, its expression frozen in a strange, knowing smile. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as an inexplicable sensation of being watched washed over her. Without thinking, she reached out to touch the dressing table. The instant her fingers brushed the cool surface, the house seemed to groan, the walls trembling like a living thing. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through her very bones. Claire stumbled back, horrified, but someone seemed to urge her forward. She could feel the pull, the desire to understand what was happening to her home, to unlock the mystery of the laughter, the shadows, the whispers in the dark. The hum grew louder, as if coming from beneath the floorboards. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the ground, and that's when she heard it. A soft, distinct tapping. It was rhythmic, almost like the sound of someone lightly tapping their fingers on wood. She followed the noise to a hidden panel in the floor. Her pulse quickened as she pried it open. Beneath the floorboards, she found a small, dust-covered box. It was locked, but there was something about it that felt familiar. She couldn't resist. She retrieved a small key from her pocket, one that had come with the house's old set of keys, and inserted it into the box's lock. Inside was a collection of items. A faded photograph of Lucille Ball, an old script for one of her shows, and something else, a small, intricately carved wooden figurine, shaped like a dancer mid-performance. Claire's hands shook as she held the figurine. Just as she lifted it, the air in the room grew dense, heavy with an eerie presence. The lights flickered overhead, and the faint sound of laughter echoed in the distance. But this time it wasn't playful. It was sharp, almost strained, as if coming from someone in distress. The dressing table rattled violently, and the reflection in the mirror morphed Lucille Ball's face, now staring back at her. Not with a smile, but with a look of desperation. Claire felt her pulse race. It was as though Lucille herself was trying to communicate. The laughter continued, but it was followed by a soft, broken whisper, barely audible over the storm of strange noises. "Get out!" Claire froze, the air suffocating. She wasn't alone in the room anymore. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The whisper echoed through Claire's mind, as though it came not from the walls, but from deep within her own thoughts. She turned slowly, her heart racing as the temperature in the room plummeted. Every instinct told her to flee, but something about the voice, the urgency, the sorrow compelled her to stay. The reflection in the mirror shifted again. Lucille's face now appeared in full, her eyes wide with what looked like fear, a mix of panic and sorrow. The figure in the glass raised a trembling hand, as if reaching out to Claire. The laughter, once light and playful, became increasingly strained, like the sound of someone trapped, unable to escape. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to close in on her. She glanced down at the wooden dancer in her hands. It felt alive, warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed something of the house's energy over the years. She could feel a strange vibration in the air, and the hum from the floorboards grew louder, now accompanied by an unsettling rhythm, like the tapping of unseen feet. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she dared a second glance at the mirror. Lucille's expression had changed again, now contorted in a silent scream, her lips parted but no sound coming from her mouth. Behind her, the shadow of a figure began to take shape, a tall, looming presence that didn't belong. It was the silhouette of a man, his features indistinct, but his cold, malevolent eyes pierced through the reflection, locking onto Claire's with terrifying clarity. She stumbled back, the box falling from her hands, its contents scattering across the floor. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was preparing to step through the glass and into the room with her. Claire's breath quickened as she backed into the corner, her thoughts racing. What did this mean? Who was that man? The question lingered in the air like a dark cloud, unanswered. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, as if the house itself was alive, groaning in distress. The faint tapping grew louder, faster, now an unrelenting drumbeat that seemed to reverberate through her chest. It was a warning, an urgent message, but from whom? And what was it trying to tell her? Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with such force that it rattled the entire frame. Claire gasped, turning toward it in panic, but it was too late. A shadow darker than the rest emerged from the darkness, its outline almost liquid in its movement. It slithered across the floor, impossibly fast, and before she could react, it was right behind her, its presence suffocating. Her heart skipped a beat as the air thickened, filling with the unmistakable scent of roses, Lucille's favorite flower. Claire's hand shot to her throat as she gasped for air. She could feel a presence so powerful, so overwhelming. It was as though the house was pressing against her from all sides. The whisper returned, but this time it wasn't a plea. It was a command, clear and sharp, resonating in the very core of her being. Leave before it's too late. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. Claire's eyes darted to the mirror, where Lucille's reflection no longer looked terrified. It was now calm, almost peaceful, as if her spirit had finally found some sort of resolution. But the shadow behind her in the glass was not gone. It was still there, lurking in the depths, watching, waiting. With a sudden jolt, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. And then, the unmistakable sound of laughter returned, but it was no longer playful. It was twisted, distorted, echoing, louder and louder until it felt as though the walls themselves were about to shatter. Claire couldn't tell if the sound was coming from the house or from something far deeper. She turned, almost instinctively, toward the dressing table once more, her mind racing for an explanation. She could see it now. The figurine she had found, the dancer, wasn't just a trinket. It was a part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the house, the laughter, the shadow, none of it was random. This was not just a haunting. This was a warning that Lucille had known all too well. Claire's mind raced as the laughter swirled around her like a living thing. It was no longer just a haunting sound, it was an omen. She could feel it deep in her bones, the weight of something ancient and powerful pressing down on her. The shadow in the mirror was no longer a mere silhouette. It was growing, forming into something solid, something she could no longer ignore. She blinked, and in the instant her eyes were closed, the room seemed to shift. When she opened them again, the furniture had changed. The elegant armchairs were gone, replaced by old, worn chairs from a bygone era, the kind you might find in an old, forgotten parlor. The wallpaper had darkened, its once vibrant patterns now muted and torn. And most disturbingly, the mirror before her was no longer reflecting her image, it was showing something else entirely. A vision of the house, but not as it was now. No, this was a different time, a different era. The vision in the mirror was of a young Lucille Ball, standing before her dressing table, applying makeup in the dim light. But she was not alone. A tall figure, a man with dark, haunting eyes, stood in the doorway, watching her. Lucille didn't seem to notice him at first, but then, slowly, she looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't a smile of warmth, it was cold, predatory. The air in the room seemed to thicken as he stepped closer, and Claire could feel the temperature drop in the real world, as if the room was being transported back to that moment. Then the vision flickered. The man was now standing behind Lucille, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, his face now inches from hers. Claire could see the tension in her face. Lucille's eyes widened, but she was paralyzed, unable to move. And then, in the mirror, the figure whispered something into her ear, though the words were muffled, distorted. Lucille's hand shook as she reached for the dresser, and Claire could almost feel the chill that ran down Lucille's spine in that moment. Suddenly, the vision blurred, and the laughter returned louder, more chaotic, like a chorus of voices all rising together in a crescendo of madness. Claire's pulse quickened as she backed away from the mirror, the echo of the distorted voices reverberating through her head. It wasn't just Lucille's laugh anymore, it was the man's too, deep and unsettling. And then, as if summoned by the cacophony, a figure stepped into the room, a woman, but not Lucille. She was tall and thin, her features shadowed and her eyes dark, like those of the man in the vision. She moved with an unsettling grace, as though she were gliding, not walking. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The woman's presence was suffocating, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. With a fluid motion, the woman turned to face her, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice low and melodic. It felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with her words. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Claire couldn't move. The woman's gaze locked onto hers, and it was as though the world around her fell away, leaving only the two of them in the suffocating silence. The woman stepped closer, her presence growing heavier with every inch. "Lucille wasn't the only one with secrets, you know," she said softly, her voice now almost a hiss. "And you've uncovered them. The question is, can you survive them?" As Claire opened her mouth to speak, the woman raised a finger to her lips, silencing her. "Don't say anything," she murmured. "Just listen." The air around Claire seemed to hum with energy, and suddenly, the room was flooded with images from the past, dark and fragmented. Lucille's life wasn't just filled with laughter and lights. It was tangled with something far darker. The man in the vision, the one who had whispered in her ear, was no stranger. He was someone from Lucille's past, someone she had trusted. But trust, Claire realized, was a fragile thing in this house. The woman stepped back, her eyes still locked onto Claire's, her smile growing colder. "It's too late to turn back now," she said, her voice echoing as if it came from every corner of the room. "The house has chosen you." Suddenly, the ground beneath Claire's feet seemed to give way, the floorboards creaking and groaning as if the house itself were alive. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching for something, anything to steady herself. But it was no use. The room seemed to collapse around her, the walls closing in as if they were trying to trap her. And then, everything stopped. The vision, the laughter, the woman, it all fell silent, as though the world had taken a breath, waiting. But the air was still thick with the unspoken, the secrets that had been hidden for decades. Claire realized, with a sickening twist in her stomach, that she hadn't just stumbled upon a ghost story. She had stepped into something far more sinister, something tied to the very soul of the house itself. The question lingered in her mind as the silence grew oppressive. What would happen if she stayed? Claire's mind raced as the silence hung heavy in the air, the weight of the house pressing in on her. She knew, without a doubt, that the house had a history far darker than anything she could have imagined. The woman's warning echoed in her mind. "The house has chosen you." Her pulse quickened, the cold chill in the room biting into her skin. Claire could feel the presence of the house, of Lucille and the secrets it held, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She could hear the soft, rhythmic tapping once more, the haunting melody of the past, only now it was her own footsteps joining in, as though she was becoming part of the house's dark rhythm. Without thinking, she grabbed the dancer figurine from the floor, its warmth almost comforting now. As soon as her fingers brushed against it, a flash of light erupted from the mirror. The room trembled, and the laughter rose to a fever pitch, almost deafening. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Claire blinked, and when her eyes refocused, the room had returned to normal, the old, dusty furniture, the moonlight spilling in through the windows. The mirror reflected only her own face, pale and shaken. But there was something else in the air. Something had changed. The house was no longer a haunted memory, it was alive, a living testament to the stories it had absorbed over the years. But Claire knew she could never escape. The house would always pull her back. She turned, walking slowly toward the door, her hand still gripping the figurine. As her fingers touched the doorknob, the faintest sound reached her ears, a soft, melodic giggle, distant but unmistakable. And for the first time, she realized, it wasn't just Lucille's laughter. It was her own. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.